Welcome back, everybody. This is for English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 14th of September. And where we are is moving from talking about literature to actually reading some literature. In the last class, we were trying to define what literature is, particularly how do we evaluate if literature has some quality to it, something that's worth our time for academic study. And today, what I had assigned, and you can see this in the notes below, are two stories that have very similar titles, A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman. And although they have similar titles, they're very different in terms of their quality. And I hope that this helps to illustrate the difference between formulaic fiction and literature that is worthy of academic study, or at least could be studied from an academic perspective. And we had talked a little bit about how ultimately one of the criteria of good pieces of literature is that it has an element of creativity to it. And when you think about many of the pieces that are written in our society, they oftentimes are formulaic. They follow particular genres or styles. There are strict criteria of elements that they need to fulfill. And not that there's anything wrong with that, certainly in terms of escapism and entertainment, that's wonderful. There is a certain comfort in knowing what the story is going to be about and what you can expect from it. And from a profit perspective, these stories are oftentimes very lucrative. I also teach a class in Gothic literature, and we're talking about the very same thing, how oftentimes horror stories can be very formulaic, but those aren't the kinds of stories that we would be devoting our attention to in Gothic literature. At any rate, I wanted to show you an example of how formulaic these things could be. And the textbook just happens to choose romance, but it could have been any of a number of genres, including horror or Western. So this is in no way to disparage romance novels. But as you can see, and this is on page 26 of the edition of the text that I ordered, there are very strict rules about how to construct these stories in terms of what the plot should be about, the growing relationship between the heroine and the hero, and then after a number of complications, they discover lasting love. And love is the major interest. There shouldn't be any other major themes like murder or extortion or hijacking or horror or supernatural elements that are part of that story, or else it wouldn't fall into the category of a romance. The heroine should be a modern American woman between the ages of 19 and 28 who represents today's concerns. The idea that there's also a certain level of escapism here, because 19 to 28 is usually considered, or oftentimes is considered in our society, the height of female beauty. And the story is told from the third person, from her point of view. The assumption is that the average reader will be female, but that's not to say that's the only demographic that would read romance novels. She's attractive and nicely dressed, but not like the other woman, who is basically the heroine's rival. She's not glamorous or filled with false facades. And her personality is spirited and independent, but not pushy or stubborn. In other words, she's reached that sweet spot there. She's self-reliant as well as vulnerable. Common careers are things like nurse and teacher, interior designer, no menial work, because ultimately that is what the reader is perhaps escaping from. And while she can also be a doctor or a lawyer, and I always think when I read this in the text, well, that's very kind and generous, isn't it? But sarcasm aside, while she can be a doctor or a lawyer, her profession shouldn't dominate her life, because ultimately the focus of this text is not about professional achievement, but it's about relationship and romantic achievement. The hero, about 10 years older, can be foreign or American, needn't be handsome in the traditional sense, but must be strongly masculine, always tall and well built, that looks terrific in a three-piece suit as well as sports clothes. And I'm basically reading some quotation here from the text. The past might be slightly mysterious or shrouded by some painful moment. perhaps a death of a previous wife or a divorce, but it wasn't his fault, and chronic problems such as alcoholism, drug addiction, or sexual dysfunction should be avoided at all costs. And again, I'm reading from the text just to give you a sense as to what it would be like if you were actually working with a publisher trying to write a romance novel. There are secondary characters such as the other woman who serves as a foil to basically the virtues of the heroine, the other man who could be the decent sort who's sort of there when the hero isn't around, or the selfish individual who schemes rather than loves. And then other characters serve as almost like furniture. They're just there as the extras that you might expect in a movie. Setting is expected to be contemporary, romantic, and exciting. New York City, London, Paris, Rio. Not to disparage Greenfield in any way, but I doubt that Greenfield would be the setting. And the marriage can take place, though, in a suburb or small town. But the initial setting should be rather contemporary and exciting. Love scenes, they may make love before marriage, but neither is promiscuous, and the description shouldn't be too detailed. And then the writing, and this is what always makes my heart feel so sad, and I'm going to quote exactly from this. Avoid extremely complex sentences, very long paragraphs, and lengthy descriptions. Use concise, vivid details to create the heroine's world. Be sure to include the full description of the hero and heroine's physical features and clothes. And dialogue should sound like ordinary conversation. The overall writing should be contemporary English without slang, difficult foreign expressions, strange dialects, racial epithets, or obscenities, although a few mild swears are right. Are all right. And perhaps even worse, we're even given information about what length should be. Length, 55,000 to 65,000 words in 10 to 12 chapters. I always think about this when students ask me how long their writing should be, and my response is that their assignment should be as long as they need to be. And I don't mean to be facetious, but the idea is that ultimately there's a certain level of creativity. It's almost like asking an artist, how many colors should the artist use in a painting? Well, the artist uses as many colors as necessary in a painting. And I say the same about language in terms of length of assignments. That said, I understand that length can oftentimes give you a clue as to how much time and effort to put into a piece. So I usually give some suggestions. For instance, when we get to the point where we are writing a journal, I would suggest about approximately a page or so for each short story that you write about, and I'm asking you to write on 3 short stories. So that would probably be 3 pages total, but that's merely a guesstimate. It's as long as you feel is necessary and would be useful to you. So when we think about all of this, obviously it's not too surprising that we're going to get something that is very cliche and very predictable. And again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that or with melodrama, but it probably isn't worth a whole lot of time for our academic study. And if you didn't have a chance to read the excerpt, actually, it's not even a short story, from A Secret Sorrow, I can summarize it for you very quickly. Faye can't have children. She's afraid to tell her partner Kai about that. She wants to leave him to save him from the horrors of being in a childless marriage. He tells her that he's fine, and she says no, and she's ready to leave. And he says, we'll adopt. And she says, really, we can do that? And he says, yeah. And they live happily ever after. Of course, I'm condensing a little bit here, but not to in any way insinuate that this is not a serious problem that couples can experience, but the resolution occurs over a few sentences, and obviously that is not real life nor realistic. So I wanted you to see that as an example of the sorts of things that probably are not worth much of our attention from an academic perspective, from a literary lens, though I know that oftentimes romance novels have been read as examples of media and popular culture, which is also another interest of mine. And I also teach classes in that, where you can study things that were never meant to be studied from an academic perspective. Take something like a commercial on television and try to view it from a critical perspective. But In terms of thinking about something like A Secret Sorrow, well, certainly it could be examined in terms of the way that relationships are portrayed in the media and popular culture. For our perspective in this particular class, Introduction to Literature, a much more interesting piece would be the second piece that I had assigned for us to read that also has a similar title, A Sorrowful Woman, but it's much more complex and has much more depth. But before I get to that, I had assigned a section on literature, pages 30 to 43, where basically to try to determine how we would go about defining literature, it's not written primarily for profit. And that's not to say that it isn't written with the hopes of profit, but generating profit is not the sole purpose. There usually is some sort of a social message that's integrated within the text as well. It's not formulaic or predictable or trite. And this will be interesting when we talk about Shakespeare, because Shakespearean dramas fall into genres or categories, whether they be comedies or histories or tragedies or tragic comedies. And one could say that there is a formulaic element to that. There are certain rules and expectations that you have, but there also is a certain level of creativity and a really unusual and sophisticated use of language. Literature usually is not classified by genre, although it could be classified by genre. Certainly, there is the genre of short story that we are focusing our attention on during the first third or so of the semester. Basically, a short story is a brief piece of prose fiction. It usually details one particular element, but that said, brief, it can be quite subjective. There are, for literature, probably no strict rules for plot or characterization or setting or writing or length, much like I shared with you for the romance novel. And when you are writing about fiction or literature, and this is the section on pages 46 to 65 that I had assigned, on page 47 in particular, that might be a page that you might want to dog ear, where there are a list of questions that you might want to consider when you are writing about literature. And I'm going to cover these questions right now as well, in the event that you don't have access to the text. And certainly, you don't necessarily have to answer all of these questions. There are 33 questions in total that were given here on page 47. But think about all of these in the back of your mind when you're reading a piece of literature or when you're writing about a piece of literature. They divide it up into things like plot. So certainly that's the first place to begin reading. If you need to understand what's happening. If you don't know what's happening, you can't do any other kind of analysis. But thinking about, for instance, the first question they ask you, does the plot conform to a formula? And then number two, what is the source or nature of the conflict? Every story has some sort of conflict associated with it, or else there wouldn't be any reason for the story. The conflict may or may not necessarily be resolved, but you want something to happen. And what is the conflict for the protagonist? That's usually considered to be the central character in the text. Is the story told chronologically? So thinking about the order in which the events are given to us, because that could be very important. And in other words, an author might be telling a story that isn't chronological for a very particular reason. What does the exposition reveal? That's the background information. Short stories are short, so it's not necessarily easy to give lots of background information. So how does the author weave that in? Keep in mind that an author is giving us just as much information as the author wants us to have. So if we don't know something, it's because the author thinks it's not that important. Is the conflict resolved at the end? Again, as I was indicating, it may not necessarily be. And is the plot unified? And usually what you're going to find is that there are connections between the events that are happening within the plot. Character. And this is question 7. Do you identify with that protagonist, our main character, and who or what is the antagonist, which is considered to be, let's say, the villain? And the antagonist need not be human. It could be the natural world, for instance. Something, if you're familiar with an author like Jack London, he oftentimes presents nature itself as the antagonist. Question 8, does your response to the characters change as you read, and if so, why? Question 9, are the characters round? In other words, do they have multiple elements associated with them? So they're more realistic. Or are they flat or stock characters where basically they have just one quality or trait, or they're very predictable, they're very stereotypical, something like the nosy neighbor. How does the author reveal information about characters? As especially with a short story, because it's short, there isn't a whole lot of space to be able to give us information. I've oftentimes argued that perhaps short story is a more difficult genre to write in than, let's say, novel. Because if you're writing a 300-page novel, well, if you don't necessarily have a strong section for 3 or 4 pages, that can be perhaps forgiven, but in a short story, every word has got to count. And what is the purpose of the minor characters? Why are they there? And then also thinking about the setting. Where is the story taking place? And why did the author make the decision to have the story take place in that particular locale or during that particular time period? If we are given that information. If we're not, it's probably not important. But if we are, then it probably is important. And can the setting be used symbolically? A symbol is when something represents something else. So can the setting be representational? So for instance, the times of the year, the seasons are oftentimes symbolic. Spring oftentimes represents the beginning of life, hope and rebirth and renewal. Summer can represent the height of life. And fall can begin to represent the descent of our lifetime, and then the winter can represent the ending of our lifetime or old age. That's not to say that an author need to use that particular symbolism. In fact, sometimes authors know that there are associations with things, and they deliberately upset our expectations to try to surprise us. But the setting can be used as a symbol, and it can also be used as an antagonist, as I was indicating. Point of view, who's telling the story. Just like in real life, where you're getting the information from is going to influence whether or not you can trust that information. And how would the story be different if we were getting that information from a different character, let's say? The narrator, the person who is giving us information, is the narrator reliable? Is the narrator objective? Does the author comment directly on the action? And again, if it were told from a different point of view, how would that change our understanding of a story? And symbolism, how did the symbols contribute to your understanding of the story? And are there actions or characters or writing or objects or words that can be viewed symbolically? Themes or major truths in a particular story. What is the theme? Though I think perhaps a more accurate question is, what are the themes? That you can have multiple themes or truths or statements that are being made in a story. And is it something that's said explicitly? Probably it's much more implicit. It's something that's implied and that we need to try to figure it out. And is that theme a confirmation of your values, or does it challenge them? Remember, you need not necessarily agree with the author nor with the characters in the story. This gets back to what I was referencing last class with your brain on fiction, that one of the ways you can learn about other people and you can learn about other situations is reading about literature. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with these individuals or agree with their actions, but you should at least understand these individuals and actions. And then things like style, tone, irony. This goes into the actual use of language. What is the style? When we talk about things like diction, what kind of language is being used? Is it formal and academic? Is it more informal? And why would the author make the choice to use that particular language? The tone, which is the emotional feeling that the story offers us. Is it happy? Is it sad? Is it a combination of the two? And irony. When we talk about irony as things that are unexpected, but it usually has a twist associated too. So it's not just something that's unexpected. The best example I can think of with irony is a short story collection of episodes from the Twilight Zone. And in fact, if you are familiar with the original Twilight Zone series, you know that some of the best short story writers of the day wrote for that series. And the story was called Time Enough at Last. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it's about basically a kind of mousy individual who is basically henpecked by his wife and abused by his employer. He works in a bank. And all he wants is time to be able to read, but he can't because his employer wants him to work and his wife also wants him to do chores around the house. And it just so turns out that one day this employee ends up locking himself mistakenly in the bank's vault, which ends up being a blessing for him because there is a nuclear attack while he's in the vault. And what ends up happening is that while society is destroyed around him, he survives because he was protected in the vault. And as he emerges amongst the rubble of society, at first he's quite distraught and horrified that everything is gone. And then he's quite pleased that everything is gone because he realizes that he no longer has an employer or wife or anybody else to bother him, and he has time enough at last to read. So he works his way through the rubble to the rubbles of a library. We have to suspend some disbelief here. And he gathers a bunch of books, and he's quite content because now he can be alone and he can read. And then he looks down at the books. Now, he happens to be wearing very thick glasses. And at that time, glasses were made out of real glass rather than plastic, or at least these characters' glasses were. And as he looks down on his book, the glasses slide off his face and they fall onto the ground and shatter. And basically now he has time enough at last to read, but he can't see. And this is one of the best examples of irony that I can think of in terms of storytelling. And expect that irony will oftentimes be an element of short stories. This is question 26, how does the author's use of language contribute to the tone of the story? Again, this gets back to whether or not the story seems to be humorous or sad. And do you think the story is worth reading more than once, which was something that we were talking about last class, that perhaps that's one of the best definitions we can come up with a piece of literature, is that each time you reread it, you can come up with new meaning and new interpretation. And then critical strategies. If you remember last class, I talked a little bit about how scholars can read a piece of literature based on a particular lens. So biographical critics focus on author biography, while psychological critics might focus on the psychology of the characters. And I had suggested to you that rather than identifying with a particular critical strategy and reading everything from that perspective, then instead you let the literature sort of lead you as to which critical strategy might be most useful for that particular text. So some of the questions about critical strategies: is there a particular critical approach that seems especially appropriate for the story that you're reading? And again, questions like, does biographical information about the author give you additional understanding? Does historical information about the time period give you additional understanding? And if so, how? What kinds of evidence are you focusing on, and which are you not focusing on? Because that you're picking and choosing of particular pieces of evidence will influence your particular interpretation. How might your own experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions inform your interpretation? In other words, we all have bias, and that bias will be part of our reading. And given that there are a variety of ways to interpret a story, which seems to you to be the most useful and why? So you can see that what I've done is in the notes below talking about reading all of literature, and specifically A Sorrowful Woman on page 39. Things to consider are things like the author, who is writing the text, the date in which the text was written. This is very important because this will give us a sense of ultimately the society of the author. And the text might be written during that time period, but the text could also be set in the past or in the future. We need to read the text to see if the author has placed it in the past or in the future. If we aren't given any information about that, we can assume the text was written in the time in which the author is writing. The title. Titles can be very, very important. So thinking about how the title is significant for a text, and you may not be able to figure that out until you've actually read the text in its entirety. The plot, which is the first place to begin. What is happening in the text? It's what I call the junior high school book report. But we need to move beyond plot. Not just what is happening. What's more important is why are those things happening? The characters, the setting, the use of language, themes. The ending. Endings are very important and oftentimes are ironic. Important quotes that can be referenced. This will be also important when you're writing about a text because you're going to need to use evidence, which means paraphrase, summarizing elements of the text within your own words, but also using quotation. In other words, verbatim language, word for word. Many of these texts end with questions at the ending that can help spur you to think about the text, questions that are specific to that particular text itself. It's one of the advantages of having the textbook. And of course, just thinking about your own questions and concerns, because sometimes the questions are much more interesting than the answers. And sometimes the questions have multiple answers associated with them. So I had assigned a sorrowful woman, and you can see that in the notes below. I was able to find a link to that so that you could read that online if you don't have access to the text itself. And what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit more about a sorrowful woman next class. That's on page 39 through 43, because I would like you to reread A Sorrowful Woman. Now, we had talked about the fact that ideally you would read 3 times. The first time for plot, the second time you would be reading for analysis and interpretation, and the third time you would be reading A Sorrowful Woman for basically refreshing your memory before you begin to read the text. But I want you to read A Sorrowful Woman in light of the suggestions, or read it again in light of the suggestions that I've given you. For instance, many times readers are surprised to find out that at the ending of the story, a sorrowful woman dies. Yes, she does. She commits suicide. And if you're listening to this and saying, whoa, I missed that, then this gets to the point of needing to read carefully and critically. This is something that we didn't need to do with A Secret Sorrow, but we definitely need to do with A Sorrowful Woman. Thinking about things like why these characters are not given names, or why the title is A Sorrowful Woman. Now, I'm not sure necessarily if you asked yourself these questions when you were initially reading, but definitely you need to ask yourself these questions. And notice that at the ending of A Sorrowful Woman, we are given questions to consider that are directly related to the actual text itself. So these are questions you can ask yourself when you are reading A Sorrowful Woman. These are on page 43. Basically, they ask you, how is a sorrowful woman different from a secret sorrow? And how do the two women's attitudes differ in a secret sorrow and a sorrowful woman? And how are the woman's problems in a sorrowful woman made much more complex than in a secret sorrow? What is the theme or central point of a sorrowful woman? How might you think of A Sorrowful Woman as an unromantic sequel to A Secret Sorrow? And the question of, can you reread both of these stories, A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, and have them both be interesting? And I would suggest that you probably wouldn't need to reread A Secret Sorrow, but definitely you have to reread A Sorrowful Woman. Thinking about how marriage is portrayed in A Sorrowful Woman, and discussing your feelings about the woman in A Sorrowful Woman, and how is it that she remains a sympathetic character in spite of her refusal to be a traditional wife and mother. And what we have in parentheses here, this is question 10, it might take more than one reading of the story to see that Godwin does sympathize with her. The author sympathizes with her. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to sympathize with her, but we first need to understand how and why the author sympathizes. Then we can decide our own feelings. And that the happy ending of A Secret Sorrow might seem like a fairy tale, but nothing strange or mysterious or fabulous happens in it, which is usually what happens in a fairy tale. In contrast, A Sorrowful Woman begins with an epigraph. And an epigraph just happens to be an opening statement. And the epigraph is once upon a time. That causes us to expect a fairy tale ending, but that story is clearly a fairy tale gone wrong. In other words, we don't get a positive ending here. And that is going to be our attendance question for today. And that for A Sorrowful Woman, and you can see this again in the notes, it begins with an opening statement, that epigraph that reads, quote, Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times, unquote. That's on page 39. And the question is, why do you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with that epigraph, with that opening statement? And again, think about reading A Sorrowful Woman with the suggestions that I've given you. So the way to read A Sorrowful Woman is to read right from the very top of the page, to see who the author is, Gail Godwin, to see when she was born, 1937, to see that she's still alive, to read the brief bio we're given about her, that she has a PhD in English from the University of Iowa, so a very respected institution. So we can expect that she's using lots of literary elements in her work and might be referencing previous pieces of literature. The title, A Sorrowful Woman, and asking ourselves questions such as, why is this a sorrowful woman? Why isn't it the sorrowful woman? Why is it not a sorrowful man? Or why is it not a sorrowful child? Or why is it not a sorrowful family? And the date in which this piece was written, 1971. And what do we know about the time period of the 1970s, and how could that be related to sorrowful women? And then, of course, our opening statement, once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times. And why is it that we're beginning with this statement, and what might this statement mean? So we'll talk about the details of the story next class, as well as talking about Story of an Hour. Now, Story of an Hour is a short story that was in the earlier set of readings that I had assigned about how to go about reading literature. But I wanted you to revisit that story again with a more critical and analytic lens. And you can see that also what I've done is I was able to find a link where you could find the Story of an Hour, so that if you don't have access to the text, you can read the Story of an Hour from the link below. We'll also talk about reading and the writing process next class as well. And basically, at this point, we've transitioned from our introduction to literature, what is literature and how do we go about reading it, and now we're actually starting to read pieces of literature. So in my mind, the actual short stories begin with A Sorrowful Woman, and then we move forward to the Story of an Hour and all of the other pieces that we'll be reading in this section. So all of these are possibilities for your journal assignment, which isn't due until the ending of the short story unit, so that you can choose from all of the short stories that we've read. But you can always hand in a journal early, so that once you have identified 3 short stories that you've written on, even though we're not done with our short story unit, you could certainly submit in your journal to me. And next class, in the section about reading and the writing process, there are some suggestions there about how you could go about writing things like journals, as well as writing things like papers. But again, the idea behind the journal is about you being able to grapple with some of the questions or the themes or issues that you are finding within the text. It could be based on some of the suggestions I've given you today that you might want to consider when you're reading a text. It could be some of the specific questions that are at the ending of a text. It could be something that's based on our class videos that I've talked about in terms of the text. It could be something based on the class discussion forums that you and your classmates are responding to. And again, I'm going to be responding to all of your responses. You don't necessarily need to respond to your peers, but certainly you're welcome to think of it as kind of like class participation, the way you would be raising your hand in class if you wanted to make a comment. So all of those are ways that you could think about what to discuss with the journal, or any questions or concerns that you've got about a reading that I can help address in one way or another. But again, we'll talk more about the journals. But starting with A Sorrowful Woman, we are now starting to read our short stories. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about A Sorrowful Woman and also the Story of an Hour. Take care. Bye-bye.